have a question, Deb. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Dale. What's your question?
Well, when I hit audio, it came on, and video's got a red mark across it, and it won't
So
let me open. Well, why is that?
you can't open it?
No, it won't let me open. I was just on a program before this and no problem. And now I got this red mark, like,
Dale, do you have a message saying that recording is in place that you need to click on to agree?
I'm looking, recording.
It'll probably be at the top, Dale. I've had that problem before. David's right. Yeah, it's usually at the top.
I don't know why it,
Did you see a message from me asking you to turn your video on?
oh, start my video. Okay, let me click on that. It did not come on. Cannot start video. Fail to start the video camera. Please select another video camera in settings. Huh.
Okay, so what you need to do down by where it has your video camera, you've got that little arrow that points up.
Okay.
Click on that,
Oh, okay.
and
And then
then it should say use the webcam. Is that checked?
it's USB camera, blur my background, auto frame my video, and video and effect settings.
Is there a check mark next to the USB?
Yes.
Okay, well, maybe you need to log out and come back in and see what happens. Log off and then come back in.
Okay.
Okay, Paul, let's go ahead and get started. You're muted, Paul.
There now. I think I'm unmuted, and hopefully we have Dr. Boxer's picture in front of you.
You're good. Yep.
Very good. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the ongoing Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. It is my real pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Elise Boxer, who is the Associate Professor of History and Native American Studies at the University of South Dakota. She also serves as the Director of the Institute of American Indian Studies, and she was invited because Dr. Thomas Murphy indicated that her work on Mormon settler colonialism was something that we definitely need to hear about. And the idea of inventing the Lamanite and the other kind of ites that are related is something that I think all of us need to benefit from, because whites are ites too. Her book, Mormon Settler Colonialism, is available from the University of Oklahoma Press. But her research reaches well beyond that to include indigenous studies, settler colonialism, indigeneity, and Mormonism. She's the co-author with Jerome Clark of From the Skin, Defending Indigenous Nations Using Theory and Praxis. I am delighted to welcome Elise to our forum and ask for her your amicable consideration and perspicacious questions to help us get beyond the ites to a compassionate cross-cultural appreciation appropriate to agents of the Prince of Peace. I'm going to make an adjustment from what is usual, for I intend to sing the prayer this evening, and still let us pray together. Peace I ask of thee, Great Spirit. Peace, peace, peace. When we learn to pray sincerely, cares will cease. From the hills as I gather courage, vision of the day to be, strength to lead and faith to follow, all are given unto me. Peace I ask of thee, Great Spirit. Peace, peace, peace. Dr. Boxer, the floor is yours. I would commonly, I'd like to give you the chance to give a presentation and take questions afterwards, or if you prefer to have people interrupt you with questions, then that is your prerogative. And so, if you would like to designate your preference that way to begin with, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, I'm okay with either. I did put together like a PowerPoint. So first let me just go ahead and introduce myself, and I'll go ahead and just pull up this PowerPoint. And this is just based on my own book. And so let me go ahead and just pull that up. Oops. Okay, so ha mitaki yapi, Elise Boxer imaki yapi Damakota, Wakchicha Wakpa Edwatie. So hello, my relatives. My name is Elise Boxer. I am Dakota, and I am from the place of Poplar Trees, which is now today known as formerly by the United States government, by the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux tribes, which is located in Northeast Montana. I'll go ahead and start kind of with a disclaimer. First and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge that while I am Dakota, I was born and raised also as LDS, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, I do not speak for my community, nor do I purport to represent views of the LDS Church. What I'm sharing today are just kind of really my own lens in which I see specifically like the Book of Mormon, but broadly the LDS Church as a religion and its impact on Indigenous people. You're welcome, anyone, if you have like questions. I'm more than happy to answer those as we kind of go. But I wanted to start with what I call like a theoretical framework. So for my theoretical framework, I very much privilege Indigenous authors. I believe it's important when we specifically are writing about Indigenous people that we not only use the people's voices and histories, but also the way in which they think about the world. And I draw upon scholars who, in my own educational like formation experience, really influence the way I think about how I do research or how I write about these histories. One of my favorite books that I always use, even as I teach. So I'm also an associate professor here at the University of South Dakota. I teach in the Native American Studies program. But I introduce my students to theory, and I want them to kind of understand how they can also conduct research, especially as undergraduates, and even if they go on to graduate school. But one of the books that we read is Linda Twice-Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies. Linda Twice-Smith is a Maori scholar from New Zealand and offers up a different way to think about research. I think what she's probably most well known for in her book is that she talks about research as like a dirty word in Indigenous communities, where really this idea that people go into Indigenous communities, extract like the knowledge and information that they want, and then they go back and write their own work. And she really kind of shifts that understanding and really asks us to think about how we're doing research, and is that research reciprocal? And I think this is important to all communities, not just Indigenous peoples. Like if you're interested in studying a people, I think you do need to go talk to the people themselves. That may require you to learn perhaps like another language, but she really articulates that within her book. And then the other scholar and mentor of mine is Waziataween. She's a Dakota historian who wrote Remember This, Dakota Decolonization and the Eli Taylor Narratives. And she basically privileges Dakota language first and foremost, and then has English translations within it. But I like it because, again, it really shifts the way we understand history. But more specifically, which may also be interesting, is the use of basically oral histories. From an Indigenous perspective, what we look at as stories that have been passed down from one generation to another. And while even if we may not have experienced it, those stories remain in our families, in our communities, and people can tell those stories. And we very much see those stories as like factual, as real, as something to be learned from. And that's why I really like her book. When I use this term settler colonialism, I specifically kind of use it in the context of Mormons. And I know there's, again, criticisms of the use of Mormons by the LDS Church. And I just want to note that I use that term because in the historical moments that I'm looking at, from really Joseph Smith, really up to, like the early 20th century, and throughout the early 21st century, that's what was used until relatively recently. So I do use that phrase, Mormon settler colonialism, but specifically I look at Patrick Wolf, who wrote an article on the elimination of the native. And what he writes in there specifically, right, is that settler colonizers came to stay, and that invasion is a structure, not an event. And so specifically, and I'll have some examples throughout my presentation for you today, but I apply that to looking at like Mormon settlers as they move west. That it's not just, right, July 24th, 1847, when Mormon settlers arrive into what is now the Salt Lake Valley. It's what happened afterwards, and how does that remaking of land and history go in hand together. And then finally, I'm really interested in and hopefully talking today about is what I call triangulating indigeneity along with Mormon and U.S. settler colonialism. That Mormon history, much like Indigenous history, is U.S. history, but they move together and against one another at different moments. And then finally, sources. What I try to do with my book was specifically look at sources, or what I call like the discourse produced by the LDS Church, and provide, I would say, my framework or my lens as a Dakota woman to reread that. And by rereading that, what do we learn from those particular histories? And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start as like an example to kind of say like what happens when we reread history through an Indigenous lens, and what does that look like? For example, in my introduction to my book on Mormon settler colonialism, I actually began with this particular image. If you're not aware of this, this happened and occurred on June 15th, 2020, on the Brigham Young campus in Provo, Utah. And you can kind of see my image cuts it off a bit on the bottom of the PowerPoint, unfortunately, but you'll see racist kind of emblazoned on the bottom. And, it was, again, like vandalized. I argue as like an act, a decolonial act by people that we don't really know, have not yet ever been identified. But really, what does that mean to kind of confront a history and a narrative that people typically don't know about? And it wasn't just the Brigham Young statue. So this is in front of the Abraham O. Smoot administration building, which again is kind of near the center BYU campus. But you'll also see some of the signage that is also, again, with an X kind of sprayed through it. And you'll see, again, the use of red. Red is like symbolically important for Native people, broadly Indigenous, even Dakota and Lakota people. Red is like sacred. They're used in different ceremonies. I thought it was interesting in these two different cases that they're using this red spray paint. But what I find fascinating is what's interesting is really the reaction to that. What happens then in terms of people's reaction, both on and off campus? And what we see is, again, a wide range of responses. So, for example, you're going to see people who are like in the top left, you'll see like, honestly, right, where's the lie? And then you'll see right immediately below that, those who did this should be punished to the fullest extent allowable by law. I get that racism and bigotry are huge problems in society, but this is not a solution. Vandalism is still very much a crime, and those who did this are now criminals. And then you'll see other headlines that are local news, like Deseret News, for example, that kind of bring attention to this particular issue. For example, Abraham Owen McKay says, like, my ancestor's name should not be on the building. And you'll see again, like, just other kind of like headlines. What I also find interesting is kind of like the response to it, right? What happens then when Brigham Young specifically responds to it? And they ultimately form a committee several days later. But in that initial, again, account, what we don't actually see is Indigenous representation on that committee. So you don't see anybody who has, for example, represent Indigenous people. You have a scholar, Farina King, for example, who's Dene, who's also actually written a book about Dene or Navajo Mormon members. If you're interested in looking at that, it's, I think, through the University of Kansas Press, but she is also an alum of BYU, and she starts this kind of campaign to get representation from Indigenous people. And then BYU eventually again responds and appoints Michaelyn Steele, who's in BYU's law school. And so she's a professor of law. And so you'll see kind of like a shift within that. Eventually, the following year, and I will say from an administrative perspective, it's interesting how quickly they were able to put the committee together, but then also gather data. Eventually, in February 2021, they released this report on race, equity, and belonging. And the belonging part is what I'm really fascinated by, is like formations of identity, both as people of color, but then also that intersection within their religious identity as well. And in this particular report, one of the things that they recommended was that basically BYU students of color oftentimes feel marginalized. They feel as though even though they're members of the faith, they actually don't feel like they belong on campus. And one of the recommendations that the committee put forth was they actually recommended that BYU make changes to some of the names and to the buildings, including obviously the example that I provided. Now, the reason why this is important, right? Because if many of you can recall, it feels like yesterday, but not yesterday, but like the COVID, and the pandemic was interesting in bringing up some things nationally. This is the same moment that we have, the killing of George Floyd, right, in Minneapolis. You also have discussions of Confederate monuments at the same time, but really these ideas of whose histories matter, whose histories get embedded into monuments and buildings, and then what happens as you rename them. What does that change in terms of these structures of racism? And what, like I said, the recommendation was to basically rename the building. What's interesting is that the BYU is currently in that process of renovating that particular space, and they have completely demolished that building. This was taken earlier this year in January 2026. Photo credit, just to acknowledge, is Dr. Christopher Jones, who's a faculty member at BYU in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. But this I borrowed from his social media page with his permission. But what I, again, want to bring to light is what's interesting in terms of that building is completely gone. With the exception of, again, the signage and then the monument itself. So everything has been demolished except the two things that people, especially within that report, had questions about, right? And so it kind of lends itself to some of these larger discussions in terms of, again, whose histories matter, and whose perspectives matter, especially when we talk about as it relates to belonging, and how people want their physical space to reflect their experiences as well. Yeah, so and so now I'm going to shift a little bit to looking at where else can we see this play out, right? We see this literally in this particular relatively recent moment, right, where BYU kind of doubles down and they're not going to change structures, even if it means, when we look at scripture, like all are unlike unto God. Well, not at this particular moment where there's certain voices that get silenced. We also see this within, I'm going to call it like not just the Book of Mormon, but discourse around scriptures. And specifically what I call like the Lamanite subject position, because this isn't just about like racial categories, right? And just in case, so we're all on the same kind of page, I just want to make sure that like indigeneity here in the United States is so complicated and it's fraught with tensions. Because, for example, as you may, when I introduce myself, I introduce that I am an enrolled citizen from the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes. That matters because what I'm saying is I meet my tribal requirements for enrollment, but also that's a federally recognized tribe. And there are many tribes in the United States who never did get federal recognition. And that matters in terms of who gets to claim this category of indigeneity and who doesn't get to claim that. There are also moments where there are people who are, I would say, more fluid in their identity. And so again, it's not just like a racial category, like classification. I would argue it's a political classification that gets complicated by the Book of Mormon, especially as its claims as Indigenous history. And I do have another chapter that I've written where I talk about the Book of Mormon specifically as like an example of Mormon settler colonialism, because this is not the history that I grew up knowing, and again, as I say, I'm speaking from my own experiences and my own perspective, but that's not Dakota history. We have our own stories, our own creation stories, how we came into being as a people that connect us to specific places, right? So for example, in this particular region, that would be close to what is now present day Minneapolis or Badote, where the Missouri and the Mississippi kind of meet together. It's that confluence of the river that becomes like the site of creation. There's also other stories for the Ochete Shakoween, the Seven Council Fires, what people may know today of us as like Sioux people. They have their own stories of creation. And none of that aligns really with the Book of Mormon, at least for us as a people. I do want to acknowledge that there are members of the faith who see a connection and kind of parallels, one of which what I would say the importance of family or kinship. For Dakota people, right? One of the biggest things that is important to is our kinship, our relationship to one another, but also, for example, for us, it's not just our relationship, because it's not just the language we use, it's how we treat one another. And so everybody, again, like depending on our relationship or our kinship relationship, dictates how we interact with one another. That's very different than in the Book of Mormon. And I bring this up and I write about this in a chapter in an edited volume where I specifically talk about an experience that I'll share again with you tonight, that came out of my experience in graduate school. I went to do my master's degree in history at Utah State University. In my particular cohort that year, I was really the only female, probably one of the youngest persons in the program, and really the only, well, I was also the only woman, the only person of color. And that first year was a very challenging experience for me for a variety of different reasons. It was also the first time I lived away from home. But what was interesting is the second year, there was an influx of new graduate students, but also one of my really good friends who I became friends with, and she finished her first year, I finished my second year. And then I went on to grad school at Arizona State University. But when she finished her master's degree, we went on vacation together, which again, if you ever go on vacation with a friend, it tells you a lot about what kind of friends, if you're friends after that trip or not. But we actually ended up going to Austria, and she brought two other friends with her who, again, grew up in the LDS church, also educated. They had served missions together, which is their common link. And me and my friend, our link was through our educational experience. But one of the discussions we had was specifically about what it meant to be Dakota and Mormon. And what was interesting was that I was being told that my history is in the Book of Mormon, and that I specifically still, well over, so like almost 20 years later, I remember being told that, that my history is not only in the Book of Mormon, that I would know that my people or Native people, that we have always been a bloodthirsty people. We've always been a warfaring people, and that I was a Lamanite basically. And I push back on that. And that's really where my interest in the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, as creating what I call this Lamanite subject position. So how do people who have no experience with Indigenous people, who've never lived around with Indigenous people, interacted in meaningful ways, how do they imagine Indigenous people as Lamanites? And I really look at the Book of Mormon as its production of what, again, I term this Lamanite subject position, because it requires this religious discourse to give meaning to what it means to be Indigenous. And you see this reinforced not just in the Book of Mormon, but you can see it in the Doctrine and Covenants. You can also see it in other publications produced by the LDS Church. And I'm going to show you just like two more examples of that, or actually three examples, so you can kind of see what that looks like, again, through my lens and where I'm making this connection. So this is again an illustrated version of the Book of Mormon, and you can still find this online. I actually did a screen grab of this online earlier this year, but this again is illustrating those scriptures that many of us know, where it gives meaning to what it means to be Lamanite, right? So you'll see here in like Second Nephi, right, that first kind of, if you're looking at, it's going to be your upper left, where quite simply, right, they're telling children, Nephi obeyed God. They worked hard and were blessed. They built a beautiful temple. But then you'll see on the other side, on the top right, that Laman and Lemuel followers, they called themselves Lamanites, and they became a dark-skinned people. God cursed them because of their wickedness. And even looking at just the illustrations, you see that those that are Lamanites are, again, appear darker in that particular illustration. And that you'll see that again, that reinforced on the bottom, the Lamanites became lazy and would not work. And then also you'll see that the people who followed Nephi called themselves Nephites. The Lamanites hated the Nephites and that they wanted to kill them. And I'm using this again to kind of mark a very specific moment and discourse to say in illustrated versions, right, this is how Indigenous people are being understood as Lamanites, and how some of this rhetoric around Indigenous people or Lamanites as either lazy, right, or wicked, this is where those early kind of constructions began. It gives meaning to what it means to be Lamanite. And inverse, right, is the opposite of Nephites. I do not go into much detail nor debate over, again, back and forth. There's moments of righteousness, right, and wickedness between the two groups. But what I'm really looking at is that idea about Indigenous people as Lamanites still remains embedded within, I would say, probably like the popular culture, or just some of the culture of the LDS Church. That even I continue to experience that. I experienced it in grad school as well when I went to school in Arizona. The other image I want to include was when, again, you'll see these Arnold Freiberg's illustrations included in the Book of Mormon, and there's a series of them, right? But I draw your attention to this one because what the different things that we see in this image that we may not necessarily unpack, especially if you're not critical of the image itself. So one, right, we're going to see how, again, Lehi, what I'm assuming is going to be Nephi, Sariah, and like family and followers, right, are all there. But one, I want us to look at how they're being depicted in terms of even, again, how they appear in terms of their coloring. Also in the far distance, right, you're going to see land, and you'll see like the clouds, right, and below that is land. You also see somebody on the ship or the boat, right, who's looking, and it's like they're pointing to the land. And it was really interesting. I was having this conversation with a friend several months ago, and I never noted it because when we talk about this movement of settlers, it's typically focused on men specifically. But in this context, what marks this even more different is that women are going along, right? They're going to this quote unquote new world. But even that language, right, about Lehi and his followers as really like immigrants to this continent becomes part of this narrative that really is used to kind of remove Indigenous claims to land as well. And again, like I say, you can see kind of some of that, the land in the background, but again, it kind of feeds into stereotypes that we have about land, and especially about who is and wasn't there at these particular moments. And then finally, comes from the ensign, where really at the quote unquote day of the Lamanite rite, what we see are really going to be this like depiction, right? And in this one's interesting too, because while I focus specifically on the United States, you see that this definition expands beyond the United States, that we're talking about Central and South America, right? We're also talking about the Pacific Islanders as well, who are then going to be as part of, again, these broad definitions of Lamanite. And then you see that shifting focus and policies eventually that play out really in the late 1970s through the 1980s as well, really through the present moment. Because what's interesting is while that initial focus by Joseph Smith and others was really on American Indian people and what they understood to be the United States, eventually it moves beyond and it goes along and coincides with their missionary efforts. But even now, when most of the membership of the LDS Church resides outside of the United States, there's an interesting shift of this Lamanite discourse where people are making arguments, right, that Lamanite people, well, it wasn't just, American Indian peoples here in the US. What they were really talking about were people in like, Mexico, Central and South America, and those numbers, right, of people converting who make connections to the Book of Mormon, for example, maybe as their history. You'll see all sorts of kind of like archaeology that kind of coincides with that as well. But it's used to support that kind of like narrative and argument, even if not everyone fully supports that. I can pause here if there's any questions at all. I don't think there's any in the chat. I'm trying to monitor.
Elise, you made a very early mention of reciprocal, what was the phrase was that reciprocal history?
Like a reciprocal relationship in terms of research.
Oh, that's it.
And yep.
Reciprocal research is what you said. And
Mhm.
I wanted to inquire about that because I'm not sure. I think my group will appreciate expanding upon that.
Yeah. So when I talk about reciprocal relationship, it's basically this idea, and I'll tell you how I teach my students, where just because we have questions about a community doesn't mean we have the right to go ask them. There's natural human curiosity about particular topics. And I think one for Indigenous people, and specifically Lakotas and Dakotas, has to do with ceremonial practices, right? Things that happen in Nipi or Sweat Lodge or things that happen at Sundance. There's like always studies and people who are wanting to participate in that. Yes, it's interesting. Yes, that's important. But I always tell students to really shift their way of like thinking about that. And when they go into a community, is to really ask questions as to what does that community need? And this means, for example, and this is again, I understand it's a very academic approach in some sense, but you got to go into that community and get to know the community. You need to go and, get to know tribal leaders. And there are some communities, and I would say quite a few communities who have what we call institutional review board. So anybody who does research in their community should be going through their IRB process and basically saying, I have permission from, I'll use my community as example, from Fort Peck to go into their community and to do research. They know that I'm here, they know that I'm asking these questions, and they have this support. The other thing when I think about reciprocal relationship is this research useful to the community? And again, this can be broadened out to outside of Indigenous communities, but is there topics of research that either people just haven't done yet, that individuals can do that would be useful for the community? And that could be anything really, but that's really giving the communities that are being studied a right to shape what that research looks like. And in that context, it's not just somebody who's interested in research questions, publishing articles or books. It's really, is that research useful for the community? And if so, what does that look like? And so that's what I think about when I think about reciprocal relationship, like research and that relationship where it's back and forth between one another.
And so how does that relate to whose history?
Yeah, it relates to whose history because we don't understand. So when we think about history and specifically Indigenous history, you can't not write a history of the people if you don't know the people themselves. And that means being immersed within the community. That means understanding like language, for example. There are some stories that are only going to be told in the language, and there's just no way to it's not that there's no way to translate them into English, it's that it's difficult and challenging to translate verbatim into English. And so that's why you need to have like that command of the language. It's very similar that if you went to study, for example, French people, you wouldn't go study French people without understanding French itself, right? And so it's really kind of the similar argument in terms of when we think about history and how we write about history, knowing the language really helps kind of pivot and shape the way we think about history. And so even if we look at it from a Western perspective, even histories about my own people, for example, start with an anthropological record about, oh, they started in this particular area, they migrated, in this year, etc. Well, if you take it from a community perspective, what we're saying are what creation stories connect us to a particular place and why. And then ultimately that shifts like the way that we think about the world and the histories that we write because they're coming from that particular community experience that reflects it. The other part of it too is that even when you're writing these histories, you should also have your people in the community read them. Even before you publish or try to do anything with the research, if you're interviewing people, for example, you should always provide transcripts. There's moments where people may want to take things out or add things in, and that kind of shifts our way that we understand like histories and really that kind of reciprocal history and that relationship.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that reminds me of the book Hanta Yo by, I believe her name was Hill, which was translated, if I understand correctly, translated from the English into the Lakota, then back into the English. As a means of trying to provide more of that shared identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of things like again, like these histories, I think everybody ultimately benefits from reading these histories or understanding different histories, right? Even when we talk about like spiritual belief systems, one of the things that I introduce, especially to non-native people, is that indigenous spiritual belief systems are rooted in the land, right? Like they're tied to the land in ways that are not embedded within like the physical structures of churches themselves, which is why you have to understand those histories to understand why place becomes important and that there's only certain places in which certain spiritual practices can take place. They're not meant to be practiced everywhere, right? They're tied to a specific place, to a specific region, and that's why again spiritual practices are unique to each community and to people that again you can't really take outside of that beyond those communities.
May I suggest then that you give us the comparison between meanings of Mateo Tipi and the Devil's Tower?
Yeah. So if you look at, that's a really good example. There's actually a documentary titled In Light of Reverence that has one literal case study of Matotipila. Matotipila or Bears Butte is a sacred site to a variety of peoples, including Lakota people. And in the month of June is seen as like I would say a ceremonial month, a sacred month where people go to that particular area to offer up prayers, to offer, to participate in certain ceremonial practices. Um, but when you compare that to, again, non-native people's understanding of that place, that is like a public, like part of the national park system. And those are as if actual physical space and where you can see the conflict between those different worldviews and place. Because specifically during the month of June, there's been various different lawsuits historically where it's not that they're asking the United States government, right, to protect indigenous lands, or to say non-indigenous people can't be here. It's just saying, just understand that in this particular month, and that this is sacred to us, that we need access to these particular places. But for some non-native people, I think that's challenging to understand, because I mean, this was made popular by the film. I think it's the Encounter of the Third Kind. Right, like you see this imposing like physical structure, but people like to climb that. And that is very contrary to especially Lakota practices, because they see it as desecrating that particular place. And that's where those conflicts come together at Montotipila or Bears Butte. It's a place where, again, different ways of seeing the land and interacting with the land are just in contrast to one another. Ultimately, in cases and especially in lawsuits, the argument by the United States, or, as it's made its way up through the courts, is that the National Park Service can't sanction a specific religion. They can make recommendations, for example, for climbers not to climb during that particular month, but it's just a recommendation. It's not something that they can enforce.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there others?
Not seeing anybody right now.
Okay. Well, I'll kind of go through and just give you a few more examples, because again, like when I talk about Mormon settler colonialism, I'm very much just interested in ways that we can reread histories, scripture, narratives about the land that are embedded in the land. And now I'm going to specifically move to a more kind of contemporary understanding. Oh, maybe. There we go. This is the Place Heritage Park. This is located in Salt Lake City, Utah. And you'll see the park, as you come through like the canyon as well. You can even see it from like parts of Salt Lake, especially if you're aimed in that direction. There's a lot of markers that will point you to this is the Place Heritage Park. But I look at this as a way to see, how do we embed belonging and Mormon belonging onto the land? And I'm going to look at specifically some of the structures, right? Like where we talk about narratives about Brigham Young. You'll see, for example, and you'll see him there in the wagon. But I want to draw our attention specifically to this with Chief Washakie. Chief Washakie is in the center. There's a couple different, there's all different sorts of like bas reliefs, and then monuments, and kind of placards throughout the park, even at this specific monument where the middle pylon is like over 60 feet tall, right? But Chief Washakie was Shoshone, and he and his people were some of the first converts to the LDS Church. But it's interesting how they talk about Chief Washakie, and he's seen as really like a friend of Mormon people. And in his arms, you can see a peace pipe. And you'll see that as more like, again, a ceremonial practice, where people are welcoming Mormon settlers. And I use him as an example again to look at, when we look at the construction of like this Mormon settler position, but also looking at, where do Indigenous people belong? And in this, it's on the backside of this particular monument, but also specifically Chief Washakie. And like I said, Chief Washakie is seen as kind of like this friend um, to Mormon people, and they ultimately become some of the first converts, and eventually create, like at Fort Hall, which is not too far from Salt Lake, one of the first like Lamanite branches of the LDS Church in the American West. What's interesting about this particular park, if you haven't gone there, it's opportunity to kind of enter into like a moment in time that's like frozen. It's meant to represent not just Mormon settlers, but really settlers at that particular moment. They have all sorts of different things you can participate in throughout the summer when it's open. But I want to specifically focus on these two, or actually three structures. Um, I include like the one on the left. It's interesting because it's a concrete structure meant to be a teepee. Teepee you're going to see as more um, well, one, people see it as like mostly largely plains tribes, right, that utilize teepees. But it's also kind of infers that people are like a nomadic people, but it's meant to be a structure that people move around. Even for Dakota people, people think that we only lived in teepees, but we didn't only live in teepees. We also had very specific structures and earthen lodges that are in specific places throughout what is now Minnesota, that people forget that we lived in. On the right side, what is interesting is you're going to see Hogans for Dene or Navajo people, and you'll see one that is supposed to be for men only and then for women only. But what's interesting about these particular structures is they're literally along like the base of like the mountain range, and it's really a far distance away from the center. So you can walk into the park. At the entrance of the park, you can be in that kind of settler town, but you really have to know that these structures exist, and you have to walk up to the back of, again, like the range to know that they're there. And then you get to see kind of indigenous history in the Utah context. What's interesting as well is that these Navajo structures, Navajo people, while many live in Salt Lake City today because of the relocation program, predominantly live in what is now southern Utah, but it's again included into the park as very recognizable structures that mark indigenous presence. We also see this downtown by Temple Square. There is another monument. This may be recognizable in terms of looking at South Temple, but again, it's another statue of Brigham Young. And at the bottom right, and he's kind of hard to tell, but at the bottom right of the base is basically just like a native man that gets included. But there's nothing to mark him specifically in terms of what community he comes from. Is there anything that we can learn about him? There's nothing really that we can learn beyond that. But again, these are just a few examples. You can see a lot of things in terms of downtown Temple Square. I'm not sure what it's going to look like. I know they're doing a lot of renovations, and it's been a few years since I've been there. But when they open up the Salt Lake Temple, I'll be interested to kind of go throughout. And I will talk very briefly shortly about the Manti Temple. Um, Now we're going to shift just to talking about the Indian student placement program, right? So again, why do these scriptures matter, right? Why do this understanding of Lamanites matter? Even Joseph Smith, right? Like if you look at some of the discourse around his talks about like Native people, missions to Indigenous people, right? One of the first missions of the LDS Church. You see it get manifested in actual policies and programs, and one of them is the Indian Student Placement Program. On the far left, you're going to see a variety of different individuals, including Elder Kimball. This is before he became the president. He eventually gets known, right, as like the Lamanite prophet, but he's meeting a variety of different people. If you're familiar with Indian peoples in general and Indian country, what's interesting is a lot of these individuals go on to different spaces. But the guy standing directly behind Spencer Kimball is Eddie Brown. And if you're not familiar with Eddie Brown is a product of the Indian Student Placement Program. Eventually, he serves as underneath the Secretary of the Interior as part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I just pointed out because it's important to see in terms of how some of these individuals who are highly educated then become part of these other structures in terms of the U.S. That impact the real lives of Native people. You'll also see again Kimball to the right, where these again are predominantly Navajo girls who are posing with him as well. But these policies matter, and I'm going to return to this because while it begins, people like to say unofficially, but I say illegally. It began illegally in 1947 and does not get formalized until 1954. It goes throughout really the 1970s, and you'll see its decline after the passing of Spencer W. Kimball. And people just didn't feel like that program was like effective enough in creating like that Day of the Lamanite, which again is a manifestation, right? That Indigenous people are going to blossom as a rose. You can find all of those kind of references in the Doctrine of Covenants. Um, And then I'll go ahead and kind of just end on like kind of the final more contemporary examples. Because again, we think about scriptures and like the Book of Mormon, at least perhaps I do from like a historical context. Really like these moments that happened on this continent like over 500 plus years ago, but they have real implications for Indigenous people today, and especially for those who want to remain as active practicing members of the LDS faith. What we see again is that the first presidency makes this announcement on the historic temple renovations in again March 2021. You'll see the Manti Temple on the right side. You'll also see again tensions that emerge between very different views of those who want to preserve like these pioneer temples, right? And then those who want to say like this is a moment to reimagine a history that reflects this collective good, collective membership, including Indigenous peoples. And we'll see again here as well some of the imagery that many of you may be familiar with in the Manti Temple. And again, drawing your attention to, again, like the chief in the middle. And it's kind of like this parade of history as well. And again, he's like very much in the middle, the center, especially when Mormon ceremonial practices are happening. Um, these are some of the other images that you can see. It's a close-up of that one. And these are, again, I use these images from the Salt Lake City Tribune. I did ask for permission to use them, but they're copyrighted by the LDS Church. And when I asked for permission, I was denied. So just know that the photo credit goes to the Salt Lake City Tribune. And then finally, the last two examples are going to be again the publication of the Come Follow Me curriculum during the pandemic. And here is again that iteration of scripture of Lamanite people who are seen as cursed people, right? And you'll see that again, some of the scriptures, the LDS Church later kind of makes changes to the online version, but this is after literally millions of handbooks have already been published. And my argument is that just is another reiteration of scripture that draws upon, again, racist tropes of Indigenous peoples as Lamanites, with, again, darkened skin, which is a sign of a curse that they continue to carry today. You'll see some of the, again, back, like the pushback, again, by the public in general. And then finally, I'll end with looking at the Indian Student Placement Program as well, where eventually you have individuals who participate in that program who ultimately sue the LDS Church. I bring this to our attention simply because that program again had a negative impact, and that ultimately then these young people in their adulthood are suing the LDS Church, but they file complaints or there are cases in the Navajo Nation court system. And I think that's important to acknowledge in terms of looking at really tribal sovereignty. And the argument is that citizens are part of the larger nation, and that should be recognized within the court system. So again, lasting implications in terms of here's like interpretations of scripture. Here are programs that were created as a result of it. Here's the negative impact on children, on some of the children who went through some of those programs. And I'll go ahead and stop there, just because I'm looking at the time. If there's any other questions.
I'm confident there will be more questions, and in fact, I've already had a chance to ask a couple, means that I will defer, but I'll be happy to come back. I do see that James Lucas has a hand up, and we'll follow the regular pattern here of letting Deb help keep us in line. So Deb.
Hey. All right, thanks, Paul. Jim, go ahead, please.
You're muted if you're
Are you
asking.
there, Jim? We can't see or hear you right now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Can hear you and we can see you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. It would so anyway, I certainly recognize. So I'd like to go back to kind of the question of who are the Lamanites, which is a central piece of your presentation here. And I certainly agree that the original interpretation of who are the Lamanites of the Book of Mormon, um, basically that term got applied basically to all Native American peoples, and then it got spread even beyond North and South American peoples to peoples of the South Seas and so forth. So it got to be a very loosely, broadly defined term. Um, However, in more recent years, um, people who believe in the Book of Mormon have come to recognize that if you look at the text, it really is not describing a either continent-wide or hemispheric-wide group of events. That if you just take how long it took people to get from one place to another, and the range of the description of the geography and the cities and so forth, it simply had to be a rather limited geographical area. And also, of course, there are competing schools as to what that geography would be among those who accept the Book of Mormon as historical. Obviously, the major schools right now are those who claim that it all took place in what's called Mesoamerica, in Central America and Southern Mexico. There's another school that claims that it all took place in North America, which is more historically grounded in things that Joseph Smith said. But even those people, they're really focused on northeastern North America. They're talking about basically everything from the Mississippi east, and because they're anchored in the idea that the Hill Cumorah was in upstate New York, and so they look to very particular Native American groups like the Algonquin and the Iroquois as being the people who were the descendants, the true descendants of the Book of Mormon Lamanites. So now these interpretations have been, or this interpretation of there being the Book of Mormon itself describing a rather limited geographical area has been rather broadly accepted, although what geography it is has not, there's a lot of dispute about that. But the idea that it was really a really limited geographical area, I think, has been very broadly accepted. What hasn't happened in LDS discourse about the Book of Mormon amongst those who accept it as historical is to acknowledge then the implications of that, which is that the people who are actual descendants of the actual Lamanite people of the Book of Mormon, if you accept it as historical, actually must be a rather limited group of Native American peoples. So, for example, to take those who adopt a Mesoamerican geography, it's hard to see how they could ever argue that Lakota are in any way descended from Book of Mormon peoples. I mean, the Lakota lands are just too far away from Guatemala to argue that there may have been some interchange over, the centuries between the peoples, but really, at least, and you would know far better than I would, but my understanding is really the Lakota people really don't see there being much connection between their culture and history and tradition and those of the people of the Yucatan or something like that, which is where the Mesoamerican people claim the Book of Mormon took place. So my larger question then is that new, more limited concept of the idea of who the actual descendants of the actual Lamanites are, is that in any way, how does that impact your interpretation of the Book of Mormon, or is that impacting anyone's interpretation of the question of who is a Lamanite if you accept the Book of Mormon as being in some way authoritative. And again, I acknowledge that historically the term was very broadly defined, but I'm asking about this more modern view, which would very much limit the idea of who are actual descendants of the actual Lamanites described in the Book of Mormon, if you accept it as being basically some kind of historical record.
Mm-hmm. So those are really like interesting kind of like questions in general, right? And I think for me, what I'm more interested in is really the power to construct and define the other, and in this context, as Lamanite people, right? So at these different moments, it's really whether it's Joseph Smith, whether it's other like archaeologists or anthropologists, right, or people who get to say, this is who Lamanite people are in these specific contexts. That's what I'm interested in, is more the power, right, to be able to construct and give meaning of who gets to be Lamanite or not. So let's say if we theoretically take out, and I put this as my disclaimer in my book as well, I'm not interested in the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And I'm saying that as not to say that it doesn't matter to people. It's just my interest is more than rather to get into some of those debates, because I think underlying those debates are really people's desires to belong, to make a connection to those kind of identities for some reason, or is to legitimize a faith, um, as to prove that we've been right, and this is how we're going to prove it, right? Which I think again are interesting and problematic at once. And so I would say like this idea of like, who are and how does this impact people in this modern context, I think is interesting. And Tom, if you want to chime in, also shout out to Tom. Thank you again for always your supporting my work. Because he takes a very interesting kind of like approach, right? In terms of flipping those kind of, again, how my understanding and quite simply, right, is that in terms of like Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, right, how does that influence the writing of the Book of Mormon and like the ways that people think about that? I'm more interested in like the opposite in terms of the power to write, right? So the power that Joseph Smith and others had to not only again translate or write the Book of Mormon, right? But then also how they get to apply that at moments. And the reason why I think it matters today is because this adds another complicated layer in onto indigeneity. Because one, you have people, like I mentioned again, my example earlier, you already have people who are fighting right now. There's indigeneity, and claims to indigeneity are so important right now for a variety of different reasons, because who gets to claim that? And are they more importantly claimed by their community? And that is something where, people will ask me questions. I was like, I can prove that I'm enrolled, but more importantly, I can tell you who my father, my grandparents were, and automatically people know that I belong to this particular community. And that to me, I find is interesting, because people who very much are, I would say, um, embedded in their Mormon identity, privilege that above their indigenous identity in ways that I think are interesting. Like, how do they make sense of themselves as both, for example, Dakota and Mormon? My argument is always, I will always be Dakota whether I'm Mormon or not. But there are people who are opposite of who are, I'm very much Mormon, and it doesn't matter if I'm, let's say, Navajo or not. They don't really see that. But the fact that they're having to carve out a space in which they belong, because the other tensions in our communities is not just about enrollment. It also is, do you participate in spiritual, like ceremonial life? For some communities, that's important. Do you know the language? Do you grow up in your community? Those are all questions that become important. But when you add that layer of like religious identity on top of it, it complicates it. And in some communities, and I write about this in my chapter on the Indian Student Placement Program, where these kids are in this really interesting in-between space, right? Because they're not fully Mormon, they're not fully indigenous, but they're creating a space in which they're trying to figure out where they belong. And I don't know if that really answers your question in terms of like who are the Lamanites, but that's what I'm more like, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that how do we take this religious discourse, right? Who gets to write that religious discourse? How do we apply it? And why does it matter at certain moments in which we understand Lamanite? Who gets to be Lamanite? And more importantly, why are younger generations rejecting that label, despite the fact that other non-Indigenous people continue to insist that they are Lamanite, even if they don't see themselves in that way?
Okay, let me ask you a question about what you just said.
Mhm.
So you're saying that people are rejecting the Lamanite label. Is this uh, Native American peoples who are also of the uh, LDS religion? Or is this more broadly people in Native American communities who are just kind of rejecting all the white man's efforts to define them?
Hmm.
Or is it a combination of both?
I
Sort
would
of.
say like the only people who are interested in this idea of Lamanite people are Mormons themselves and those that are members of the faith. Because for the most part, the only other times that you'll see people concerned with it is if missionaries are approaching them and are trying to tell them about the Book of Mormon as like their history, right? That's part of it where it's definitely more within, I would say, the Mormon, like LDS church sphere, right? Of that application. Because the general, I can tell you from all of the Dakota people that I know that are legitimately in coming from a community perspective, right? Mormonism and Lamanites don't matter at all. Like that's not even a thought. You know what I mean?
Okay. And one last question then to follow up on that. Okay, so and this whole discussion has been focused on particularly the Book of Mormon
Mm,
aspects of its interconnection, whatever it is, with Native American peoples. But what about Christianity in general? How
mm,
do Native American peoples who have, not anything to do with Restoration churches
mm,
or Latter-day Saintism, but who have, been missionized by Christians for a long time, and many have become some, Christians. How do
mhm,
they deal? Is this idea of the conflict or possible conflict between tribal spiritual practices and Christian religion? Is that an issue in the larger Native American
mhm.
community?
Yeah. So what's interesting, right, is that like communities deal with these questions over Christianity in general, in terms of like a long time ago, the United States government decided what Christian religions can go to what reservations. And that's why you will see amongst certain communities why there's like a huge group of, let's say, Episcopalian, California, like Southwest is easy to say, you're definitely going to see a lot of, Catholics, because it's how they divided up reservations, communities in general. I would say if you're really interested in looking at this, there's a whole push for what we term decolonization. And there's words in our language in terms of like, because Washichu is our word for non-Indigenous people. It's literally our word for what we translate literally as like fat takers, right? Like the people who take things that like, but you can talk about letting go of like basically these Washichu ways and and that means letting go of Christianity, right? And letting go of all of these different practices. And it's hard to do that because there are some communities who have been so thoroughly colonized and internalized that colonization that we replicate those very systems. And you can see these in a lot of different places where you see an interesting amalgamation and a mix between those that are both Native and Christian. And in fact, you have a creation of like the Native American Church, for example, that's an interesting mix of certain parts of like indigeneity and Christian religion together. But there is a movement for people and not everyone buys into that though, right? That phrase that I just used of internalized colonization means that colonization basically was so thorough that we ourselves have bought into those ideas of us as a deficient or people or less than. and that we are maybe a fallen people and that we need Christianity to save us. There's definitely a group within Indigenous communities that buy into that, but you also have others who never bought into that, and families who maintain those traditional practices and reject that. And the fact that the ceremonial practices still exist today demonstrate that Native people, regardless of all of these systems, maintain spiritual practices that are important to them as a people. And that's where you'll see kind of rejection of like Christianity. And even in my book, in the work that I do, I specifically say Mormon Native peoples or Mormon Indigenous peoples, because Mormon again is removable, and they will always be Indigenous, whether they're Mormon, whether they're Catholic, whether they're, like you can go through all the religions, because ultimately it's going back to that as much as you can to reimagine a world and where we get to be Indigenous on our terms.
So are there, okay, just one last question.
Mhm.
Are there Native American communities that have so adopted Christianity that it's become a part of their identity? I mean, you're a member of our tribe, you're also Methodist. I mean, is that something that is a phenomenon?
I
I
would
mean,
say
all of
like,
us are Methodists, all of
yeah.
us, I don't know, Shoshone or whatever it is,
Mhm.
we're Methodist. If you're in our tribe, you're a Methodist. Just to pull an example out of the air.
I'm always like happy to be wrong. But I will point to, I think, Catholics and Pueblo people, or even certain California Indian tribes, because they have like these what they call feast days. They align with certain, Catholic practices, but they're also very much Pueblo at the same time. And so to be part of like Pueblo, there are certain things that they'll practice, but oftentimes it coincides with, and I apologize because I'm completely foreign to some of that. I was introduced to parts of it when I lived in Arizona, but to some of like those high holidays around like Christmas, for example. But what's interesting about that is there's a lot of scholars who will talk about how even within those systems, while Pueblos may be predominantly Catholic, what it's also allowed them to do is maintain their language and cultural practices because they embed it within Catholicism. And you can see this not in also like the Philippines, for example, when, Catholics went there, like when they were trying to destroy like Filipinos or Tagalog or other like that. It was interesting that they put the Bible in the language. It actually helped preserve it, right? So I would say that would be my example where it's embedded, and you definitely see there's a Pueblo Feminist Caucus, if you're ever interested in following them on social media, that they are looking at how do you confront these very patriarchal structures that are embedded within their systems of governance even today, their ceremonial life, because it's basically been influenced by primarily like Catholicism, for example.
Okay, well, very interesting. I use the expression, I'll pass the talking stick. I don't know if I'm being colonial to use that expression, but I'll
I think.
pass to others. Thank you, though, for your
Mhm.
presentation.
I think Paul, maybe, I don't know if your hand's up.
Okay, yes, my hand's up, and let me call on myself then. I I was intrigued by your comments about the fact that there are tribes that have not been recognized by the United States government.
Hmm.
And it strikes me that from my own limited experience that the indigenous peoples usually have clan identification as significant as tribal identification.
Hmm.
And again, clans are not recognized by the United States government, nor are they particularly recognized in the Book of Mormon that I can tell.
Hmm.
So possibly the Turtle Clan could be read into it, or maybe the Serpent Clan. But I'm curious, um, what comment would you make about the significance of clans and their absence from our consideration?
So my understanding of clans are very tribal specific. So again, not all tribes have clans. For us, for example, the Ochete Shakoween, like we have what we call bands. And so we could say that, well, I'm Dakota, like broadly. I'm specifically Sisseton Wahpeton, and that tells you like again kind of what different bands I come from within the larger like umbrella. But clans I would say are more specific to, I would say there's Meskwaki, there's all sorts of different communities that have clans. Some of the Nakota, which is used to be part of the Ochete Shakowin a long time ago, but primarily live in Canada today, have clans. But there's not like a broad like clans where everybody has clans. And so that to me, I would say is like a difference because there are different groups in, for example, I'll use California as an example. The United States stopped making treaties, I think, after 1871, and Congress, like all treaties, have to be ratified by two-thirds majority in California, because again, if you're familiar with California and their history, especially with the gold rush, they sat on over 70 plus treaties and they themselves never ratified, which means they don't have federal recognition as a community. And that matters because with treaties, they ceded huge territories to the United States government in exchange for, A, B, and C, whatever it may be. That becomes important, but that's more like I would say tribes are like an arbitrary, I would say, way to refer to a group of people. But I would say typically even, you can break it down to bands or you can break it down to even families. But it's hard to say like Turtle Clan. I'm not familiar. Like I I know people talk about like that broadly. Um, but I would say in general, federal recognition matters, but it also is a colonial construct. And the way I talk about it and teach it is, I would say its intent is to move towards genocide. Because if we're saying that blood quantum matters, even in my community, you have to be a quarter more blood and you have to prove your ancestry in our community, in our tribe, to be enrolled. If you're an eighth, you're considered an associate member where you qualify for being enrolled, but you don't get to take advantage of education or land. Land becomes important because for me as a tribal member, if I wanted to go purchase land at home, I can do it because I'm a tribal member. What it doesn't account for is that when we as Native people have to marry people outside our community, it doesn't then account for blood quantum when we become less than whatever the minimum requirement is. This is why it's important when you look at Cherokees or Choctaw or quote unquote any of the five civilized tribes. There's other tribes that do theirs by lineal descent. It doesn't matter blood quantum. It just means you have to prove that you have an ancestor on like the Dawes rolls or like when they did those census records in the late 1890s. But the reason why it matters is because at a certain point, if you can say on paper that Native people cease to exist by the government definitions, then we as a people disappear from the record. And if we disappear from the record, right, it means then these reservations that have been set aside because we ceded territories in millions of acres, and I'll use South Dakota as an example. My students often think of reservations, the 9 reservations here, as very small in South Dakota, when in fact, historically, if you look at our 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, we would have owned at the Great Sioux Reservation, would have been literally anything West River up into Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, etc. That would have all been part of our community, but that has all been chipped away because of other policies. And Michael Yellowbird, Hidatsa Rikara scholar, talks about it as statistical genocide, where if we cease to exist, then the United States doesn't have to uphold their end of treaty obligations. And that's why these like contestations over identity matter. Who gets to claim nativeness and who doesn't. That's why these things matter.
Well, I appreciate you raising that issue of the Who's history because I dug for a quarter of a century at Nauvoo. And now the sites that I dug revealed 10,000 years of occupation.
Mm-hmm.
They're mammoth hunters, bison hunters, first pottery makers in America were there. And I see it as the stewardship of the LDS having taken that over
Mm-hmm.
to appreciate and recognize those peoples. But the Mormon LDS history says it was a swamp.
Mm-hmm.
And how they reconcile a swamp with Des Moines Rapids going by is difficult. I had the very good fortune of meeting the lady in charge at Nauvoo last Friday, and was pleased that she has some anthropological and archaeological appreciation, and she even recognized that Brigham Young had asked the city council to drain the swamp at his house, and then he dug a basement underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
Under what circumstances do you put a basement in a swamp?
Right. Well, and I appreciate you sharing that because I think what also comes to mind, right, is like when you're saying like these historical records or archaeological records are also interesting because as we find out more, what we find is the things that we know about ourselves as a people are reaffirmed through the historical and archaeological record. And just for example, like the Ochete Shakoween, we believe that we as Dakota people are a people, like a star people that we, came into this earth through like the Milky Way, for example. And what's interesting is science now proves that, right? That there's stardust in our bodies, but we could have told you that a long time ago because our stories tell us that, right? So it's interesting how those eventually kind of catch up with each other, and reaffirm knowledge that we've had for, really time immemorial.
You mentioned the Musqueam and the Sauk and the Fox were at Nauvoo one generation prior to the Mormons coming there.
Mm-hmm.
500 lodges.
Yeah.
And where's that history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we make them disappear. So I'm very much concerned about that stewardship. I think we
Mm-hmm.
all have a significant stewardship accounting to take care of, but the LDS people in that particular place, because I've dug there, invested so much time in it, I'm very anxious to see that rectified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a challenge that, like I think that, something I give my students is like, we all come from very specific places, but, who are the indigenous people from the areas in which you live? Can you name them? Do you know their histories, right? And that's where again, kind of like these shared histories become important. And this again is not to lay blame to non-native people. And I tell my students the very same thing is that even I, as a Dakota person, have benefited from my own people's removal. The fact that I own a house here in Vermilion, I benefited from that because we were able to buy a house because Native people got dispossessed of their land. But part of again is being understanding of these like very complicated histories, these shared histories. And I always tell like my students as well is like it's okay to be uncomfortable and sit in that uncomfortableness, because that's where I think, learning happens and where change can happen as well.
My specific location is in Kansas City, and the Kansas City Hopewell were here 2,000 years ago. There were 8 very nice Kansas City Hopewell villages. In my lifetime, that's been reduced to 2 small fragments.
Mm,
And parking lots and apartment complexes have bulldozed and taken the place of those villages. But
mhm,
who in Kansas City knows about it? Nobody.
mhm,
It's just a very sad thing to me to see how little regard we have for being able to appreciate and protect our appreciation of ancestry.
mhm.
James and I get to dominate the discussion with this evening, so let's give other people a chance here.
And you can always email me. You can find my email on, it's literally elise.boxer@usd.edu. If you eventually come across questions, you're always welcome to ask questions later.
Thomas has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Elise, thank you for coming on to this forum. It is great to see you, and I've read your book, and I encourage everybody here to do it. And I think you raised some foundational questions for the restoration traditions more broadly. And I know that some of the folks here are not from the LDS Church, and I think there's some particularly significant material in your book that would be of interest to the Community of Christ folks as well. And that's your treatment of the Council of 50. You have a chapter on that. So maybe you could briefly, let people know about the Council of 50 chapter and how that might speak to the situation in Nauvoo when the Saints were deciding where they're going to settle next. Uh,
Mhm.
and uh, and I think that would draw the attention of a number of people here as well.
Mhm. Yeah, so very briefly, like I do have a chapter again. I in my book I take what I call like an episodic approach. Like I'm just taking snapshots of different moments and where we see Mormon settler colonialism play out. And specifically, I was really interested in the publication of the Council of 50 Minutes because I was really interested in like how that functioned, right, politically, but then also like religiously. But basically, I look at these minutes and really, what's interesting about the Council of 50 is they governed Nauvoo, and Nauvoo is an interesting space, right? Like in terms of like on the river, on the frontier, quote unquote frontier, but they're looking west, right? And how are they able to look west? And I don't mean to like offend anybody or anything, but I find it interesting where, the religious rhetoric around that is that the Council of 50 had already gone out and looked at different places where there was possible settlement. They looked up in what eventually was like what would become Wisconsin, but Wisconsin territory. They looked in Texas and they looked in the American West, in Oregon, for example. But they followed a lot of other settlers and they benefited from, again, like the removal of other indigenous people. But also, they already kind of had their, like, I'll say finger on the pulse where, like, if we need to move again, we can move out west. But they pick a spot specifically, right, in Salt Lake Valley that is outside the political periphery of the United States, but it belongs to other people. And so again, Mormons in general, I think, are interesting in that they are using their, identity as settlers when it's convenient because they do get to move west. They get to claim land. As like basically Mormon manifest destiny. And it's done under like the Council of 50. And they're basically carrying out that mission later, obviously after like the death of Joseph Smith and others. But I look at Nauvoo as like, again, a space and place that becomes distinctly Mormon, but also how the council participated and used their advantage really westward expansion by the United States, and position themselves in Texas and Wisconsin, and eventually what is going to become Salt Lake, to create and carve a space out that would become, again, specifically Mormon. That's a very brief, like, again, nutshell in terms of looking at Council of 50. I find it fascinating because there's no way to ever take that group. They wanted to act separately, but you have basically the same men who are in, the LDS church hierarchy who are then within the Council of 50. And there is no separation. Um, yeah, it's a fascinating organization, I guess, administratively.
But interesting that they put a major push toward Texas,
Yeah.
even to provide a buffer zone between Texas and Mexico. And I find that the John
Yep.
Berneisel influence there was remarkable and profound.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go back to the special place. This is the place. The special place idea, I mentioned it early on about Rainbow Eagle of the Choctaw giving us background about the Medicine Wheel and Independence. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious if that's anything that had come to your attention, if that has a place of peace, a place of negotiations, of reasoning together,
Mm-hmm.
something that is widespread, or is it something that is more narrowly focused?
My understanding, because I think that's more narrowly focused. And I can't, speak for like Choctaws or others. I think for me, my immediate questions would be like, do other Choctaws have that same belief system? Because Choctaws, even before they get to what is now Oklahoma or what was Indian Territory, like we're really further east for the most part, right? And
He was not, I'm sorry, he was not claiming it as a Choctaw tradition.
Okay.
It is a Native American tradition that he has stumbled on more recently, having encountered other people's accounts of it.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with that particular tradition, but what I will say is when I was working on early, when I was still like a grad student finishing my dissertation up, I actually just finished and I was starting to work on this book project. And this was fundamentally different than my dissertation, but I had a really good friend who was an older gentleman who was both Shoshone and Paiute. But it was interesting because his argument about independence or the New Jerusalem or Zion were fascinating, and this is where me and him didn't always see eye to eye, because he would argue that if you read the Book of Mormon correctly, it's actually Lamanites who are ushering in really like the second coming and are going to create Zion, what is in again like Independence and all these other places, in that specific place. um but his argument was if you read the Book of Mormon with a more critical perspective, that was his interpretation. Um, but I haven't really read much or seen much in terms of that importance as a gathering site broadly for other indigenous peoples.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm. The only thing I can compare it to would be like the ghost dance religion of like the 19th century, right? Like these ideas have always been there. Places change, but it's really that idea of, I think, people returning to some semblance of like their traditional beliefs, without non-indigenous interference with that.
I don't want to terminate our session prematurely because I do want to provide for all the opportunity for discussion that we can. On the other hand, I have somewhere between 40 and 50 fifth graders coming to the site tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I need to be in Iowa by 9:30 to coordinate and put that together. However, right now we're getting a heavy duty rain, and so that probably means my archaeological experience for those fifth graders may be seriously limited, which means I'm going to have to get there and do some scrambling to put together an alternative session for those little kids. Um, in any case, I don't want to. Well, and James has his hand up, so let's get his question or comment in there. But before I stop talking here, Elise, let me thank you very much for this presentation. It's a profound perception that we need, a perspective that I think has been far too readily bypassed. And I so much appreciate our opportunity to pick up an Indigenous perspective from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, just a quick question. As long as you're mentioning Lamoni, um, did were there Native Americans in southern Iowa at the time that the early members of the reorganized church decided to move there, or had the Native Americans already been pushed out
They
before the?
they fundamentally had been pushed out. There's very few early, well, there are very few 1800s commentaries, but there are some. Um, there's more, I think, in Ringgold County than in Decatur County that I'm aware of, anyway. But yes, there were Potawatomi that came in feeling like this was part of their legitimate hunting ground, and so there was some well, and the Potawatomi had been on that terrible mission from Indiana all the way to Kansas back in, what was it, 1838. And so for them to escape the reservation, have a chance to get up into Iowa and so forth. But the Iowa were the native peoples there, and so the Kiowa. And so, yes, there were some native peoples. However, in terms of Lamoni's history, Lamoni doesn't get established till 1869. And so pretty well, the native peoples are pretty well gone by then.
Okay, thank you.
Harry, go ahead.
Got two things I want to say. In the various places I've lived, I've had friends and acquaintances that are Paiute, Shoshone, Navajo, and Ute. And when we lived in Blanding, Utah, I played on a Navajo softball team. and there was only two of us white guys on that. And the Utes were just learning to play softball, so we were having a practice game with the Utes. And I had my 5-year-old son with me at the time. And I came off the field to come to bat at one of the innings, and he said, "Dad, you're the only white guy out here." And I looked around, and I was, but I wasn't a white guy. They were friends. And so it didn't matter if, I was the only one or not. But the final comment is that in the end of the Book of Mormon, the Nephites and Lamanites had nothing to do with color. It had to do with religion. And those who believed in Jesus Christ were Nephites, and those who didn't were Lamanites. I don't know who any of those people are, if they're Athabascan, Hopi, Mayan. It doesn't matter. It's how they accept the gospel that is the most important. So thank you for your presentation tonight.
Mhm. Yeah, and I just to add, and I want to thank you all who stayed on the full time and for your just thoughtful responses. And I think Terry, that's an interesting point too, because I think again, it is interesting at the end, right? And there's different parts where you can read in the Book of Mormon, but I think regardless of whether people have that belief in Jesus or not, right? It's what I think again, when I talk about the discourse around Lamanite people forget that though, and people take these ideas about Lamanites, because you don't really see people called Nephites in the same way, right? Even throughout at different moments of history, like I talked about. But I think that again is why this becomes so complicated, and there's so much more layers you can unpack. And what I presented tonight is, again, just as a reminder, my own perspective, my own analysis that is not meant to represent all Indigenous people or even Dakota people for that matter, but also to just encourage some of those kind of the critical ways that we think about identity, right? And discourse around that, because people are always going to have different belief systems, even if we may not always understand that. And I think it's always important to recognize that. But again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. And if you're always welcome to reach out if you have questions. And like Tom said, you can buy the book from University of Oklahoma Press as well. And you can always send me questions after you read it.
And I think we may need to invite you back because you've really covered a couple of chapters here, and there's an awful lot more that I think you have to share with us. So thank you so very kindly for coming and sharing with us, and we do anticipate, and for that matter, you're welcome to come back and just participate as we get these other interesting people like Tom presenting.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think it's time for me to shut things down, and so I'll sing. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. And I would hope that we could all become people of peace. May that be your blessing tonight.